Welcome to our deep dive, into decision making.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at
Okay.
excerpts from Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart
Okay.
by Gerd, Gigerenzer, Peter M. Todd, and the ABC Research Group
Okay.
to explore, how these mental shortcuts called heuristics can actually lead to surprisingly intelligent choices.
Yeah, it really challenges the way we think about decision making.
Uh-huh.
We often assume that being smart means like weighing every possible option,
Yeah.
calculating probabilities, and maximizing expected utility.
Right, like that's the
Who-
classic economic.
Yeah, who actually has time for that in
Right.
real world?
It'd be like planning a vacation and like meticulously calculating
Exactly.
every possible scenario.
Yeah, you'd never get out the door.
Right.
The book actually has this great anecdote about Charles Darwin
Oh, really?
trying to decide whether or not to get married.
Oh, wow.
Imagine him trying to apply this unbounded rationality
Oh, my God.
to such a life-altering decision.
Yeah. So being perfectly rational like that could actually backfire.
Absolutely. In fact, they call these models demons.
Demons.
Yeah, a nod to their kind of supernatural,
Mm-hmm.
all-knowing qualities.
Yeah.
There's this funny story about a philosopher
Okay.
who's struggling with a job offer,
Okay.
and someone tells him to just maximize his expected utility.
Okay.
And he says, come on, this is serious.
Right.
It just perfectly illustrates how ridiculous this idea of
Yeah.
unbounded rationality can be.
Okay. So it seems like trying to be like a perfectly rational decision maker
Yeah.
isn't
Yeah, it's not really feasible.
practical or feasible.
No.
So how do we actually navigate the world?
Well, that's where Herbert Simon comes in
Okay.
with this idea of bounded rationality.
Okay.
He recognized that as humans, we have limitations.
Uh-huh.
We don't have unlimited time or knowledge or processing power.
Right.
So instead of searching for the absolute best option,
Yeah.
we often satisfy, meaning we find solutions that are good enough.
So instead of getting stuck in this like analysis paralysis,
Exactly.
we're actually pretty good at coming up with something that works.
Yeah, think of it like a firefighter responding to a blaze.
Okay.
They don't have time to analyze every possible way to fight the fire.
Right.
They rely on their experience and training and quick judgment to come up with a plan that's effective.
Right. So it's more about
Yeah,
being practical.
it's about finding a solution that gets the job done.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that leads us to the core of the book's argument,
Okay.
which is this idea that our brains are like adaptive toolboxes
Okay.
equipped with these simple heuristics that are tailored to specific situations.
Okay. So instead of having like one tool
Mhm.
that we use for every decision,
Right.
it's more like we have this,
It's like a mechanic with a wrench,
a whole set of
a
tools,
screwdriver, and a hammer.
and we're choosing the right one.
Right. And just like a mechanic wouldn't use a hammer to fix a leaky faucet,
Right.
these heuristics aren't about abstract logic. It's about being smart and efficient in the context of like our messy real world.
So they're
Yeah.
more practical.
Absolutely.
So even though they might seem simple or maybe even illogical, on the surface, they can be incredibly effective.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that the book breaks down these heuristics
All right.
into 3 building blocks.
Right.
You have the search rule, the stopping rule, and the decision rule.
Okay.
So the search rule determines how we look for information.
Mm-hmm.
The stopping rule tells us when we've gathered enough information,
Okay.
and the decision rule helps us make the choice.
So it's like this step-by-step process.
Yeah,
Even if we're not really conscious of it.
exactly.
But how do we know that these heuristics are at work in our brains?
Right.
Is it possible that we're just like randomly guessing or going with our gut?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And the book delves into a lot of research that suggests that these heuristics are more than just gut feelings. They have structure, and they can be studied and modeled.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that in some cases, these simple heuristics can actually outperform complex strategies.
Really?
Yeah.
So you're telling me that sometimes just using a rule of thumb
Sometimes going with a simple rule of thumb can be better than
can be better than like
using a sophisticated algorithm.
a sophisticated algorithm?
Yeah.
That's so counterintuitive.
It might sound surprising, but that's exactly what the research shows.
Wow.
It's called the less is more effect.
Okay.
In certain environments, simple heuristics can be more robust
Uh-huh.
and resilient because they're not overfitted to a specific situation.
So they avoid getting bogged down by too much information.
Exactly. They avoid getting bogged down in too much complexity.
So it's like that friend who researches every single detail
Right.
before making a decision,
Yes.
and then they end up just
They get overwhelmed.
so overwhelmed that they don't.
And they can't make a choice at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody else just goes with their gut and it works out.
The book even uses this example of a Weather Channel fanatic
Yeah.
who tries to predict tomorrow's weather based on the exact conditions of the same day last year.
Oh, wow.
Right? Their model is overly complex and tailored to a single instance,
Right.
making it useless in the face of the unpredictable nature of weather.
Yeah.
So a simpler approach, like just looking at the average weekly trends,
Right.
would likely be far more accurate.
Okay, so there is power in simplicity.
Absolutely.
We've talked about bounded rationality. We've talked about this adaptive toolbox
Yeah.
filled with heuristics.
Uh-huh.
But the book also brings up these concepts of ecological and social rationality.
Right.
What are those?
So this is where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Ecological rationality recognizes that our heuristics aren't just about internal logic. They're shaped by the structure of the world around us.
So the information that's available?
The information available in the environment and how it's organized.
Oh, yeah.
And then social rationality adds another layer.
Acknowledging that our decision-making is also influenced by our interactions with others.
So it's not just like what's going on inside our head,
Right.
but how we're interacting with the world,
Exactly.
the people around us.
It challenges this traditional view of fallacies or biases in our reasoning.
Okay.
What if these aren't actually flaws,
Uh-huh.
but clever adaptations that make sense in certain contexts?
Okay, so we're reframing biases as potentially useful.
Exactly.
Okay.
The book argues that heuristics can lead to reasonable and even superior decisions when used in the right environment.
Okay, this is really making me rethink.
Yeah.
Like all of my decision-making processes.
Yeah.
So we've got bounded rationality, we've got this adaptive toolbox, but what are some of these specific heuristics? Because the book mentions a bunch of them.
Yeah, it mentions a whole collection of these mental shortcuts.
Yeah.
Each with its own unique approach.
Okay, so what's one?
One that really stands out is the recognition heuristic. The recognition heuristic. Okay, what is that?
It basically suggests that sometimes not knowing something can actually be an advantage.
Wait a minute. How can not knowing something be an advantage?
Imagine you're trying to judge the population of two cities.
Okay.
Let's say New York City.
Okay.
And, I don't know, pick a smaller city you've never heard of.
Asheville, North Carolina.
Perfect.
I've never been.
Now, if you had to guess which city has a larger population, which would you choose?
Yeah, well, obviously New York City.
Right.
I mean, it's a major metropolis. Everybody's heard of it.
Exactly, and you'd be right. But the interesting thing is, the recognition heuristic suggests that your lack of knowledge about Asheville actually helped you make the correct decision.
Wow.
If you've only heard of one city, there's a good chance it's the larger one simply because it's more well-known.
So sometimes ignorance can actually be helpful.
Sometimes ignorance, or at least a lack of complete information, can actually guide us toward a better choice.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, and the book gives a lot of examples of how this works in practice, especially when it comes to judging things like city populations.
Okay, so that's one for the mental toolbox. What else?
Another fascinating one is called Take the Best.
Take the best.
Now, this one might sound like a dating strategy.
Right.
But it's really about focusing on the first cue that clearly distinguishes between options.
So instead of looking at every single factor, we just pick the most important one.
Yeah, the book uses this example of predicting the populations of German cities.
Okay.
Instead of looking at every possible factor, like geographic location, economic activity, historical data, Take the Best might just focus on something as simple as whether the city has a soccer team in the Bundesliga.
Oh, wow.
The top professional league.
So if I wanted to quickly guess which German city is bigger, I could just think, okay, well, which one has a Bundesliga soccer team?
Exactly. And if you happen to know that Dortmund has a team and Cologne doesn't, you could reasonably guess that Dortmund is bigger.
Oh, okay, and that would be accurate.
And what's remarkable is that this simple heuristic focusing on just one cue can actually be surprisingly accurate in predicting city populations.
Wow.
Even when compared to more complex methods that consider a multitude of factors.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So we've got recognition, we've got Take the Best.
Right.
What other tools are in this toolbox?
There are many more.
Yeah.
Each suited to different situations.
Okay.
There's Quickest, which is all about using readily available information and our natural sense of numbers to make quick estimations. And then there's categorization by elimination.
Okay.
Where you start with a bunch of possibilities.
Okay.
And rule them out one by one based on specific cues.
So it's like a process of elimination?
It's kind of like a detective solving a case.
Okay, so like the book uses that bird watching example, right?
Exactly.
You're looking at different birds and you're saying, okay, well, this one's too big.
Right? You eliminate based on size, color, habitat behavior.
Until you get to the right one.
Until you're left with the most likely candidate.
And this is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
That these heuristics are so effective.
They perform really well.
They do.
In a lot of cases, they can even outperform more complex algorithms.
But how can we be sure that these simple heuristics are really driving our decisions?
Right.
Because, I mean, our brains are so complex.
Yeah, the book even mentions Bayesian networks.
Yeah, what are those?
Which sound very sophisticated.
Yeah.
Well, Bayesian networks are incredibly powerful.
Okay.
They're a computationally intensive way to model decision-making.
So they're like a supercomputer for decision-making.
In a way, yes, but here's the kicker.
Okay.
In some cases, simple heuristics like take the best can perform almost as well as a sophisticated Bayesian network.
Really?
For instance, when it comes to predicting city populations.
Okay.
Take the best can come surprisingly close to the accuracy of a Bayesian network, even though it relies on a much simpler approach.
So our brains have evolved these elegant shortcuts.
It's like to get to the same answer.
Yeah, without needing all the computational heavy lifting.
Without needing the supercomputer.
Of a supercomputer, exactly.
Wow, and it's not just about making choices, right?
Right.
The book also explores how heuristics play a role in other mental processes like memory and estimation.
You're absolutely right. These heuristics aren't just limited to decision-making.
Okay.
They pop up in all sorts of cognitive tasks.
So I'm really curious to learn more about that.
Yeah.
How these heuristics work beyond simple choices.
Absolutely.
So we've been talking about how these simple heuristics can be surprisingly effective.
Yeah.
Sometimes even better than complex algorithms.
Absolutely. It's remarkable.
But also kind of makes me wonder,
Yeah.
like, if these heuristics are so powerful,
Right.
do we even need, like, complex reasoning and calculations?
That's a great question.
Are we overthinking things?
It's something the book really challenges us to consider.
You know, it doesn't say we should completely abandon logic and probability.
Yeah.
But it does make a compelling argument for expanding our definition of rationality.
So rationality is more like a spectrum.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Instead of thinking of it as this absolute rigid concept.
Yeah.
You know, it's more like different approaches can be more or less effective.
Depending on the situation.
Depending on the situation, exactly.
And it's interesting to me that our brains seem to be able to figure out which approach to use.
Yeah.
Even if we're not really conscious of it.
It's like we have this intuition, you know, for when a simple heuristic is enough.
Right.
And when we need to, like, engage in more deliberate, complex reasoning.
It's like when you're choosing which checkout line to get in at the grocery store.
Exactly.
You're not going to
You're not going to pull out a calculator.
You're like, that one looks shorter.
Yeah, you just kind of eyeball it and go with your gut.
But then when you're making a big financial decision,
you're going to want to
think it through a little more.
Yeah, crunch some numbers and really weigh the options.
And I think this idea of ecological rationality really helps to understand that.
It does.
Because it's suggesting that our decision-making is shaped by, like, the structure of the world around us.
Right. It's not just about what's going on inside our heads,
Yeah.
but how our minds interact with the environment.
So the heuristics that we use are adaptations to the specific challenges that we face.
Exactly. We're constantly adapting and evolving.
Right.
And our heuristics are a part of that.
And then there's social rationality.
Yeah.
Which is like another layer to this.
Right.
Recognizing that we're not making these decisions in a vacuum.
No, we're constantly influenced by the people around us.
Right, the social norms and expectations of our community.
The social fabric of our lives shapes our decision-making.
And I think this has implications for how we design, like, systems and make decisions in organizations and stuff.
If we want to create systems that actually work, we need to account for the heuristics that people are actually using.
Not just this ideal of how we should be making decisions.
Exactly. Not just these idealized models of rationality.
But like how people actually think.
Yeah, the human element.
The human element, right?
It's so important.
And I think also understanding these heuristics can help us be more understanding of other people.
Absolutely.
Because sometimes we might look at somebody's decision and think, that was totally irrational.
Right. It seems completely illogical.
But if we think about the heuristics that they might be using, and the different environmental and social factors, it might start to make more sense.
It might actually make perfect sense within their context.
This whole conversation is making my head spin.
It is mind-bending, isn't it?
But in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way.
It's like we're peeling back these layers of human cognition.
It's like these hidden algorithms. Yeah. These mental shortcuts.
Like they're driving all these decisions that we make.
Right, both big and small.
Yeah. So I'm curious, does the book offer any practical advice on how we can use this knowledge to make better decisions in our lives?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think while the book primarily focuses on explaining how these heuristics work,
right,
there are definitely some implicit takeaways. Right. You know, for instance, being aware of the potential pitfalls of overfitting can help us avoid creating these overly complex models.
So sometimes simpler is better?
Sometimes simpler is better, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And being mindful of the cues that we're relying on and the environments we're operating in can help us make more informed choices.
So it's about understanding those tools in our toolbox.
Right. If we understand the tools.
And knowing when to use which one.
We can use them more effectively.
I'm also thinking about how this knowledge can help us be more forgiving of ourselves when we make mistakes.
Yeah.
Because we all fall prey to these biases.
We all have biases.
Right. And these heuristics sometimes.
And we all use heuristics.
But instead of beating ourselves up, it's an opportunity to learn and grow.
Right. To be more aware.
To be more mindful of those processes.
Of our own mental processes. Yes. Self-compassion is so important.
Right.
Especially when it comes to decision-making.
So we're all just doing the best we can.
We are.
With the information we have.
With the tools that we have available.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We've explored this idea of bounded rationality.
Yeah.
The adaptive toolbox of heuristics. We've even touched upon Bayesian networks.
Right.
And social rationality.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
I mean, the book goes into much greater depth, providing mathematical models and experimental evidence.
So there's so much more to explore.
There is a whole universe of knowledge within these pages.
But even just this little glimpse has been really illuminating for me. It really highlights...
Understanding heuristics is so essential.
It is essential for understanding human behavior.
Right, like how people make decisions.
Exactly.
My brain is buzzing.
It's a fascinating field of study.
It is.
It really is.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
So, to our listeners, we're going to take a short pause here.
Okay.
But when we come back, we'll dive into even more fascinating examples of these heuristics in action.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned. I'm still really amazed by how effective these simple heuristics are.
Right. It's incredible how well they work.
Yeah, in such a wide range of situations.
It really shows you how adaptable the human mind is.
Yeah, and that they're not just for, making quick decisions. Right, they're, built into how we interact with the world around us.
Yeah, how do these heuristics affect our social interactions?
Well, just think about, how we form first impressions.
Okay.
We often make these snap judgments based on very little information. Like someone's facial expressions or their body language or even what they're wearing.
Yeah.
And, those might seem superficial, but they can actually be really accurate.
Really?
In helping us quickly figure out if someone's trustworthy or friendly or maybe even dangerous.
It's like our brain is using heuristics to decode these social cues.
Exactly. It's helping us navigate all those complexities of human interaction.
Yeah, and I imagine those social heuristics aren't fixed.
No, they're constantly evolving.
Right. They're probably shaped by our experiences and
our cultural background.
Our culture and
the specific groups we belong to.
Yeah.
That's where this concept of social rationality comes in.
Right. It's recognizing that our decisions, even in the social situations, are affected by the social structures and the norms.
It highlights the interplay between our internal heuristics and the external environment.
So we're constantly adapting to the social landscape around us.
Yeah, we're fine-tuning those mental shortcuts based on the feedback we get.
This makes me think about all the ways we use heuristics in our everyday interactions.
Right.
Who to trust, who to collaborate with.
Absolutely. And the book goes into some fascinating examples of social heuristics in action.
Okay, what's one?
Well, there's this idea of tit for tat.
Tit for tat.
which is a strategy for cooperation
Okay.
that basically involves reciprocating the other person's actions.
So if they're nice to you, you're nice back.
Yeah, if they cooperate, you cooperate.
And if they're mean, you're mean back.
Exactly. If they defect, you defect.
Okay.
And this simple rule can be surprisingly effective in building trust and encouraging cooperation.
Even without a bunch of rules and contracts.
Exactly.
So it's like our brains are wired for cooperation.
In a way, yes.
This is so cool.
But of course, these heuristics aren't foolproof.
Right.
I mean, they're shortcuts.
Yeah.
And like any shortcut, sometimes they can lead us down the wrong path.
Like when...
Well, like the availability heuristic, for example,
Yeah.
can make us overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall.
Like if you just watched a shark attack movie,
Exactly.
you might be afraid to go swimming.
Even though shark attacks are statistically very rare,
Right.
your brain latches onto that vivid image and makes it seem much more common than it really is.
So how do we, overcome those biases?
Right. That's the big question.
Is it even possible?
While the book doesn't offer a simple solution for eliminating biases altogether, it does suggest that understanding how these heuristics work can help us start to mitigate their negative effects.
So by understanding them?
Yeah, like by consciously seeking out different perspectives and challenging our own assumptions.
So we can avoid those biases.
Right. It's about becoming more aware of our own thinking, recognizing the potential pitfalls, and taking steps to counter them.
Okay, so it's not like we're just robots being controlled by our heuristics.
No, I wouldn't say that.
We have some agency here.
Yeah, the book emphasizes that while heuristics are powerful, we're not completely at their mercy.
We can learn to override them?
We can learn to recognize them and understand their limitations and even develop strategies.
To make better choices.
To make more conscious and deliberate decisions.
So we have this toolbox.
Right.
And we can choose which tool to use.
Exactly.
It's like that.
It's an empowering message.
It is.
Understanding how our minds work can help us make choices that are more aligned with our values.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
This has been a fascinating journey into the world of heuristics.
It really challenges our assumptions about rationality.
It does.
And shows us the power of simplicity.
Power of simplicity, right?
And ultimately, it gives us a sense of agency over our own decisions.
So, to our listeners out there, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive.
We hope it sparked your curiosity.
And gave you some valuable insights.
Into the amazing power of simple heuristics.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
And those questions flowing.
And we'll see you on the next deep dive.